So bright. Bring those lights down a little bit, my friend. Thank you. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I am Yvette Moy, and I'm the University of Washington's Director of Public Lectures, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This evening, we will be hosting the founder of the Autistic People of Color Fund and Georgetown University's Assistant Teaching Professor of Disability Studies, Xīnzhèn Sun Brown. They will be introduced by the University of Washington's Director of the Center for Research and Education on Accessibility, Technology, and Experiences, Dr. Jennifer Mankoff. Before we begin, we have a few folks to thank and a couple housekeeping items to go through. So first, I'd like to thank the Center for Research and Education on Accessible Technology and Experiences, also known as CREATE. I also want to acknowledge the Disabilities Opportunities Internetworking and Technology DO-IT group. I know, I love those acronyms. They're so good, aren't they? They're so good. Create and do it. I want to acknowledge the Paul Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering, the University of Washington School of Law, the University of Washington School of Social Work, the Disability Studies Program, and the Office of Public Lectures staff and volunteers. On to housekeeping. If you haven't done so already, could you please take out your cell phones and silence them, or just turn them off, I don't know. We ask that you refrain from video or audio recording this evening's lecture, and this evening's talk is being live streamed and recorded, and you can find it on the University of Washington's YouTube page, site. It's the Office of Public Lectures YouTube site. And also, we're going to ask you to refrain from taking photographs while our speaker is on stage. This evening, you can ask questions of our speaker in two different ways. For those of you who are joining us online or live streaming, or who feel shy who are in the room, you can certainly scan the QR code that you received with your registration confirmation, and that will take you to our Slido site, and you can input your question. You can also upvote questions, too. For those of you who are feeling more emboldened and brave, we invite you to please come to the microphone here, stage right. And the only request that I make is that you ask your question in the form of a question. I'll be watching. And with that, I'm going to welcome Dr. Mankoff to the stage. And as they make their way to the stage, I'm going to ask you to please take a moment and introduce yourself to everybody around you and make a new friend tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Yvette. And I am very pleased to be here. I'm a faculty member in the Allen School of Computer Science, and I direct CREATE. And I would also like to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe, and to acknowledge that that is one of the many identity groups that we need to consider in the context of disability, as in many other contexts. So Xīnzhèn Sun Brown is an internationally recognized advocate, community organizer, scholar, activist, and movement builder, whose work addresses interpersonal, corporate, and state violence against disabled people at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nationality. With over 15 years of experience in advocacy, organizing, and policy at the nexus of disability rights and disability justice, two distinct but interconnected frameworks. They have also run for public office in Maryland, and their current research explores disability justice interventions against carceral technology and the expansion of medical legal carceral states, disability and race in transnational and transracial adoption, and decolonizing clinical literature on obsessive-compulsive disorder. As an organizer, their political homes are disability justice and abolition. As a feminist critical legal scholar, Their work engages critical race and disability theory, as well as science and technology studies. Xīnzhèn is an assistant teaching professor of disability studies at Georgetown University, where they have developed original courses on Crip Med queer narratives, the neurodiversity movement, disability law and policy, and disability and critical race theory. They are also the founding executive director of the Autistic People of Color Fund, a trans, BIPOC, and disabled-led organization advocating disability, racial, and economic justice through mutual aid, generative economies, and just transition. In addition, they have spent several years creating Disability Justice Wisdom Tarot, a cultural project celebrating the wisdom and lived experiences of disabled people of color. Xīnzhèn also serves as a treasurer and past president of the Disability Rights Bar Association, Disability Justice Committee representative to the National Lawyers Guild Board, and a board member of Disability Power Bloc. They were recently appointed as a commissioner on the Maryland Commission on LGBTQIA+ Affairs. Formerly, they led the only U.S. policy and advocacy project focused on disability rights, algorithmic harm, and technology justice for several years. Their co-authored research and policy report examines labor, disability rights, and emerging technologies in the workplace. Their recent publications appear in Future Present Arts, in a Changing America, Disability Studies Quarterly, Autism in Adulthood, and the Disability Visibility Project. Their work has been recognized in Amplifier's We the Future campaign and featured in multiple documentaries and media projects, including PBS's American Renegades and HBO Max's Persona, The Dark Truth Behind Personality Tests, among others. They are a past Georgetown Gender Plus Justice Initiative Fellow and a Justice Catalyst Fellow at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. Please welcome Xīnzhèn M. Zhǎngsūn Brown to the stage.
Hello, okay. Just checking for a moment that folks who are in the back are hearing me with a thumb in the air, and I can't actually see your faces, but I see the thumbs. Thank you so much for hosting me tonight. I am glad to be joining you and to be back visiting Seattle. I always enjoy your weather. It's superior to home. As we get started tonight, I will open with an invitation and an invocation. The image that you see on this screen shows a young South Asian woman who is lying on a bed of fallen leaves and grass beneath trees with the sunlight trickling through their branches and leaves. This is an invitation of access, to use this space in whatever way feels the most comfortable, supportive, and caring for your body, mind, and its needs. If that means lying on the floor, pacing, moving in or out of the space, using a chair that is near you and not occupied by another person to spread out your belongings or your body, this is an invitation for you to take up that space, to exist in and inhabit the space in the way that is most supportive to what your body, mind needs at this time. It is also an invitation for us, for each of us, to consider what it is that we have carried into this space, what it is that we bring with us. Have you come into this space tonight carrying your grief, your sorrow, or your mourning? Have you come into this space with eager excitement, anticipation, joy, or gratitude? Are you here tonight carrying burning anger, righteous indignation, exhaustion, or bone weariness? Have you come into this space tonight nervous or numb, overwhelmed or burned out, spent? Have you come into this space open? Have you come into this space yearning? What is it that you have carried with you into this space tonight? What is your body-mind telling you about what it is that you need, what it is that your body-mind craves and desires, what care your body-mind requests, deserves, requires. This is an invitation to you, whether you are joining us in this room tonight or online, that if you are in a place, space, where it is possible and safe for you to ask for your needs to be met, that you may do so, that you are not burdensome or wrong or a problem for asking for your needs to be met and for choosing to meet them. If you are at home, feel free to move to your couch or your bed or the outside, as Jasmine is doing in this picture. This is also a reminder that for those of you for whom it is not currently possible or safe to ask for your needs to be met, that you are not a problem or wrong, and that it is a solemn, sacred responsibility for the rest of us to keep fighting, to stay in the struggle, to keep building and weaving and dreaming a future, a present, where you can have your needs met, where you will have your needs met. As we gather this container for our time together this evening, I invite you to listen, to tune in, to the needs that your body-mind wishes so desperately, so urgently to communicate to you. Let us pause together. You may close your eyes if you find that helpful, or not if you don't want to. Give ourselves permission to exist in our body-minds. Give us permission to be, to literally take up space, to breathe, to be present. Give us permission. Permission that we shouldn't ever have to ask for, but often do, to take up space in this container tonight, to honor our body-minds, to honor those who've come before us and those taken from us far too soon, to honor those who are still living and struggling now. Thank you for taking that moment of pause. I offer this invitation in nearly every space where I give a talk, I lead a workshop, I'm facilitating with any group, and the reactions that I have are quite wildly varied. In some spaces, I give the invitation to take up space, and you immediately hear the rustling of clothing, some uncomfortable or nervous giggles. You hear people moving their bags. You hear furniture scraping on the floor. And something in the air changes because people are actually trying to shift and move and perhaps not squeeze into a narrowly designed and imagined conception of space and furniture that only some people will genuinely feel comfortable in, and the rest of us are just trying to figure it out. But other times, what you hear instead is silence, and if you were watching the room, you would see very few people moving, maybe just a little bit of nervous shuffling, but really no change at all. And the one exception to this was actually just about a week ago when I spoke to a group of students in the 6th through 11th grade. And those students, before I even finished the invitation, they were just looking at this slide on the screen, immediately all laid down on the floor. Almost all of them, an entire grade laid down on the floor. And they were giggling, and the giggles seemed like a release of pent-up energy. Like finally an adult was telling them, you don't have to contort your body into one particular mode of posture, of orientation, and of behavior in order to be seen as sufficiently respectful or attentive. I have never witnessed that kind of response to this invitation. It was refreshing. I kind of want to see that more often. But I give the invitation because even in spaces where we're gathered because we're open to learning about new ideas, or we care about social justice, or we want to fight for a better future, we are all still so often consumed by and constrained by ableist expectations and assumptions about how we should exist, how we should take up space, how we should interact with one another. And those values run deep. Those values are not just the superficial ideas about who counts as normal. They're also much deeper, and those values inflect our entire legal and social structures and the way in which we societally might approach anything, from how we design and place furniture to how we design and deploy our new digital technologies, to what we think of as the Overton window of what is acceptable discourse, or the range or the limits of that discourse in the political arena. I'm here tonight, I hope, to spark conversation and perhaps to spark some provocation in how we think and grapple with questions about disability, about technology, and about justice. You heard in the rather long biography, I need to find a short one, that my work is rooted in disability justice. How many of you all in the room have heard that phrase before, disability justice, by a show of hands? I would say for those who aren't looking, can't see, or are online, that was about maybe a third or so of the room. Now, of those of you who raised your hands, how many of you were aware that disability justice is not synonymous with disability rights? They're not the same thing, by a show of hands. I would say that is most of the same people, but not all of them. Now, I promise that no one will be cold called because law school traumatized me enough. But of you who had just raised your hands that you were familiar with this distinction, if I were, hypothetically, to engage in a little bit of cold calling, I promise I won't actually do it. How many of you think you could explain the difference between disability justice and disability rights? How many of you feel confident in knowing what that is? I'm seeing a few tentative hands. I would say less than 1/10 of the original hands that went up. Don't worry, you're safe. The hands don't need to be tentative. There will not be cold calling tonight. My work is rooted in disability justice, and I say that very deliberately, because disability justice is such a distinct framework. But to understand what disability justice is, why it is necessary for all of us to think about, and what it means when we're talking about technology tonight, algorithms, automation, and the present and future of so-called, or real, potentially, artificial intelligence, we have to go backwards a little bit. And we're going to go backwards all the way to thinking about what actually is happening to disabled people now, interpersonally and structurally. The image that is on this screen is from a protest in 2019. And you can see people with a wide range of different disabilities who are holding signs. Most of them were printed, a few of them are handwritten, and they are gathered together demanding recognition of human dignity accompanied by real money. Because anybody can say they care about human rights or social justice, but when it comes down to it, disabled people actually cost money to live. So does everyone, spoiler alert. But for disabled people, that is often much more starkly known and understood by everybody, especially the people who think we don't deserve to live, that we're burdens and drains upon society, and that we would be better off dead than alive while disabled. The kinds of people who believe that our families should mourn us while we are still alive, that we are absent even as we are literally breathing and taking up space. The kinds of people who believe that, of course, we should be taken care of, but also that we're probably driving all of our family members to depression, divorce, and bankruptcy because it's so awful to have to take care of a disabled person. So the text at the top of this slide is itself a provocation. It says, law as a technology of ableist harm. What do I mean by that? I think for many people, if you're not engaged in struggles for social justice and liberation, we tend to think about law as it is. It is a thing that exists, and sometimes it changes, and sometimes it changes for the worse, and sometimes it changes for the better, but it is. It is immovable, it is inevitable, and it governs and defines our societal structure. We have law, we have legal institutions, and you hope you never have to have a lawyer. For those of us who are embedded in an activist movement or community, law holds deeper meaning. Law becomes a tool of oppression. Law becomes a strategy by which we might secure rights or recognition. And law is representative of all of the institutions and all of the systems that we know are harmful. And so if you come from that background and you're here tonight, and I imagine more than a few of you are, then this phrasing is probably not that surprising to you. But what I find fascinating is when I ask people what technology is, the kinds of responses that I get. So if I asked a room, this room, another room, what are technologies? If we're going to talk about tech tonight, what are we imagining? Well, we're in Seattle right now, so you might be thinking about Microsoft over in Redmond. We are on the West Coast. You might go a little south and think about Silicon Valley, where Google made a name for itself. Or we might think about the tech giants and the tech billionaires who are in the news these days, people whose names I refuse to mention, because that would presume that they deserve that dignity and respect. I've just revealed a lot of my personal feelings. But technology is not just about the digital age. It's not just about software, computer programs, the apps on your phone, or even the electronics that predate all of our current discussion of AI, like the microphone on this podium, the remote-controlled slide advancer that I am holding so that I can, in theory, make sure that I am on the same slide that I intend to be on. I do have ADHD, so we'll see how well that goes. Technology is literally any tool that we might use for any purpose. Technology can be tangible, something that we hold. Technology might also be a practice or a skill that we use as a tool. We don't tend to talk about tech that way unless you're in a discussion, a study group, in some context. Could be at school, could be at the library, could be in the group chat. If we're not having an intense discussion about what technology means, we're probably not thinking about it in this manner. But that's exactly what this slide is referencing. Law is a technology. It's a tool. Law is a technology. The concept of law, the concept of the rule of law, the specific means by which we make, create, and revise law in this country or down to the locality of your Seattle City Council, these are technologies. And so, for the first part of our time together this evening, we're going to talk about how law itself operates as a technology causing harm, and specifically the harm of ableism. Now, many of you had acknowledged that you were familiar with disability justice, disability rights, and at least to some extent a distinction between them. And for those of you who weren't, I promise, I'm not going to leave you behind. Ableism, which we'll talk about on the next slide, is a system of values and beliefs. You might also think of it as a system of oppression that deliberately targets those who are or are considered to be, assumed to be, or perceived to be disabled, and also has ripple effects that affect the rest of us, whether or not you are currently disabled. So to say that law is a technology of ableist harm is to acknowledge the many ways in which law itself upholds ableism, perpetrates ableism, makes ableism possible, and worsens the kind of harm that ableist values can accomplish. This is that definition that I promised you was coming. So if you were the kind of person that's like, I would like to take notes, this is a great place to take notes. If you are not that kind of person, please disregard this comment because we're not in class. And no one's checking, and there's no quiz. See, I told you, no cold calling, no quiz. Ableism is a system of thinking and doing. It is a system of values. It is a system of beliefs. First and foremost, it targets for its harm anyone who is or is assumed to be or perceived as disabled. What do I mean by that? You don't have to consider yourself to have a disability. If other people treat you like you have one, you are impacted by ableism. You don't have to use the language of disability or like the word disability. If other people put you in that category, you are affected by ableism. And for those of us who are out loud and proud about being disabled, of course, we are impacted by ableism. Here's a really fun one. As recently as a few weeks ago, I was asked where my parents were and why I was out by myself. I really had to resist the urge to explain with a show of identification that I am an adult. I hope you all know that I am an adult and don't tell the TSA that they should think I'm an underage passenger when I leave Seattle. Ableism will affect anyone who is or is assumed to be disabled. And ableism has ripple effects that affect everyone, even if you do not currently have a disability. And if you live long enough, the likelihood that you will become disabled in some or another way drastically increases. At its core, ableism is a form of oppression, like other kinds of systematic or structural domination, harm, violence, and marginalization. What that means is that ableism is just as much about power as it is about anything else. Ableism is a system that is about power relations, the relationships between people deemed normal, healthy, whole, abled, and of power differentials between those people and the people who are instead understood and assumed to be broken, disordered, or defective in some form. I don't know what happened, but it's fine. I did actually work in IT tech support for 3 years of my life, and I rate getting phone calls from irate people that don't understand what emails are at a 0 out of 10. The internet stopped working. I don't think the internet stopped working, but let me walk you through whether you turned it on. Ableism is fundamentally about power, and the power between and the power differentials between those whose bodies and minds are treated as or assumed to be normal and ideal. Those who are, in other words, thought to be functional, stable, sane, strong, powerful, intelligent, beautiful. And on the other hand, those who are written off as expendable and disposable. Ableism teaches us, in other words, about who is valuable, worthy, and desirable, and who does not deserve to count as human, who should not exist in the present, and who should not be allowed to exist in the future. Over the next couple of slides, I will be talking about some heavier material. And so if you need to take a break, to decompress, to recenter, want to step out for about 5 to 8 minutes, and then come back, you are welcome to do that. I just want to let you all know that we will have a bit of a heavier discussion for a brief period before we move away from that space within this container. So ableism is deeply and profoundly and intricately connected with every other kind of oppression and harm that exists in society. It is both necessary for and dependent on every other kind of oppression, and that much is very obvious to us. Some people that I talk to, especially my students, are afraid that as we increasingly invest in generative AI technologies, that they will be replaced or become redundant. Because if you are not capable of prompting the generative AI program sufficiently well, if the agentic AI is able to perform your job instead of you, you will functionally have become dumb, stupid, and useless. Ideas that evoke a lot of insecurity and fear about being or being perceived as disabled. This was previewed more than 25 years ago in the sci-fi film Gattaca. Anyone remember that? Oh, yeah. I'm hearing a lot of affirmation, right? In the film Gattaca, for those of you who never watched it or are too young, it envisions a not too distant future society in which most people have undergone genetic modification to become stronger, more athletic, more resilient, healthier, more resistant to disease, and smarter, more cognitively capable. And people who choose not to be genetically modified are called invalids. It's a striking use of that term, invalids, because in the present day real world, the word invalid evokes a history of disability. A person whose disability, whether it's a physical disability or a chronic illness, has resulted in that person being unable to leave their home to engage in productive labor. In other words, to be a contributing member of society. In Gattaca's world, people who are not modified become invalids and are denied job opportunities, housing opportunity, or even the right to exist in the world as anyone else. They are treated as inherently undesirable, not good prospects for partners, families, friendships, and as functionally exiles within society. The rest of the film takes an even darker turn, but it's not the topic of our conversation tonight. So if you haven't watched it, don't worry, I didn't spoil it. You should watch it and be prepared to be really upset at the ending. So I guess I sort of semi-spoiled something. It's worth a watch, it's worth a rage, but don't throw your laptop out the window over it. Ableism is thought of often as just individual discrimination or bias, or even subconscious, unintentional bias that might affect disabled people. Maybe ableism will show up if an algorithm just screens out all the disabled people from a job, but with no malicious intention on the part of the recruiters or the HR managers that decided to acquire the algorithm to screen out their resumes. Maybe ableism will show up if some of us inadvertently make some unfortunate and ignorant assumptions about other people's capacity until we are corrected. Maybe ableism will show up in some unintentional assumptions about in what ways people can communicate or move. This is all certainly true, and for those of us here tonight who are disabled, we know that those kinds of ableism happen every single day. But ableism is both much deeper and much wider than that. Ableism affects and shows up in every form of violence, in every form of oppression that we contend with. Writing off poor people as stupid, writing off women as hysterical, transgender people as out of touch with reality, writing off Asians as contagious carriers of disease, and Black people as both superhumanly strong and as intellectually inferior to white people are all results of ableism, intertwining with, informing, strengthening, and exacerbating other forms of oppression like white supremacy and misogyny and capitalism. We're gathered tonight, I think, at a particularly precarious time. How many of you all, just by show of hands, feel awesome about the state of the country we live in? Okay, so for folks who are online, the whole room just laughed. How many of you think our economy is great? Show of hands. Adjective chosen intentionally. How many of you trust our current public health leaders? Show of hands. I heard someone scoff at that one. How many of you are worried? We're out here in the Pacific Northwest. How many of y'all are worried about this year's fire season? I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. How many of y'all are currently worried about the cost of rent where you live? That's most people. How many of you, either you or people in your immediate family, feel like you're getting paid enough to live well off of your pay? Anyone? Okay, so for folks on Zoom, I think I saw one lonely hand. Like one out of the entire room. We are living at a time of crisis. The crisis, for many of us in disability community, we talk about it as ableism. And ableism and eugenics, which is what the topic of this image is, are deeply and closely intertwined. The film Gattaca in 1999 was about eugenics. And it came more than 40 to 50 years after a lot of Americans think eugenics was over. We like to associate that word with the Nazi Party of Germany, the Third Reich, the 1930s, the 1940s, the Holocaust. Eugenics was an American export. Nazi Germany, and Adolf Hitler in particular, expressed open admiration for US policy. US policy around race, anti-Black racism institutionalized into law, US policy on Native and Indigenous communities, cultural and linguistic genocide following literal genocide. Adolf Hitler expressed admiration for US policy. And in one meeting of high-ranking Nazi officials, this is on record, German Nazis expressed that perhaps US racial laws were actually a little too harsh. Yet these are the people who were inspired by this country. Really makes us proud to be Americans. If you weren't looking closely, I just made a face. So perhaps folks watching virtually saw that a little better. The image on this screen comes all the way from the early 1920s at the Second International Congress of Eugenics. It is called the eugenics tree. It's one of the most widely used images when teaching about the early history of eugenics. And it states eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution, like a tree, eugenics draws from many sources. I'm paraphrasing the last part of that because I can't read the text from this angle. And the roots of that tree in this picture have the names of fields ranging from religion to biology and medicine and law. The law operates to further eugenics. In 1927, the Supreme Court decided in a case called Buck v. Bell that eugenic sterilization of a poor white woman labeled feeble-minded was not only not a violation of constitutional rights, but it was in the public interest. Writing for the majority 8-1, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who history likes to think of as a progressive, said that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. And that, quote, those who are manifestly unfit, unquote, should not be permitted to keep reproducing. Between 1927 and 1979, the United States documented more than 70,000 forced sterilizations, largely of poor women who were often Native Indigenous, Puerto Rican, Black, Chicana, and on the West Coast, Asian. The reasons for sterilization were, most frequently, criminality, sexual deviance, or mental defectiveness. That word, by the way, mental defective, still appears on the books in present-day US law. It is literally in the US Code, in the phrase, quote, a person adjudicated as a mental defective, unquote. This is in relation to people banned from buying firearms. That's the actual language. So no matter what anyone here thinks we should do about firearms and gun policy, the language of our law on guns addresses people adjudicated as a mental defective. It's a noun. Eugenics is alive and well. Sterilizations in the United States did not stop in 1979. Fannie Lou Hamer, famously writing and speaking about the Mississippi appendectomy, referred to a phenomenon that many Black and Native women in this country have long experienced, that healthcare from the United States government comes at a cost, and that cost is presuming that some women, because of nation, language, and race, should not be reproducing. This is eugenics in action. As recently as the last couple of years, California's prisons have come under fire for coercively sterilizing incarcerated women, mostly Black and brown women. And ICE has been found to be coercively sterilizing immigrants incarcerated in their prisons. This is eugenics. Meanwhile, in the same time period as these stories are hitting the news, Meta has been researching whether it can use its algorithmic technologies to predict future diagnoses of depression, anxiety, or autism based on a user's content and search history and engagement history. Meanwhile, several successive federal administrations, not just the current federal administration, have put money into counterterrorism and intelligence projects that are aimed at developing tools for threat assessment to identify people preemptively who might be at risk of carrying out acts of extremist violence, that in some cases rely upon content used in social media platforms or in communications to try to predict which people might be unstable or dangerous. Meanwhile, less than 2 weeks ago, a transgender student at the University of Washington, Juniper Blessing, was stabbed to death more than 40 times in the building next door to the hotel where I am staying. Meanwhile, Black trans women face the highest rates of violence of any other group within the LGBTQ community. Meanwhile, the cost of rent is unaffordable in every single state. Meanwhile, the cost of health care is out of reach. After just less than 1 year ago, Congress slashed nearly $1 trillion of funding for Medicaid and food stamps, cuts that are already coming into effect now. Meanwhile, I have students emailing me articles about Department of Defense funding for autonomous weapons systems, AI-guided drones, and missile strikes. We are living at a time of accelerated eugenics. We are living in a time of crisis. The big circle in the middle of the screen says that this is our grief, our rage, and our witness. Surrounding that big circle and smaller circles are the names of other forms of violence and crisis that we continue to live through, to witness. They name the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the crises of genocide and war, climate catastrophe, all the things that we know about. I wake up in the morning every day and I feel spent already. How many of you relate? It's a lot of hands. We feel that everything is happening all at once and has already been happening. And it is easy to feel hopeless and overwhelmed and to shut down. Not because we want it to be easy, but because that's the logical reaction to what we are witnessing. My students are terrified that AI will replace them at their jobs, and many of them also turn to AI to complete their work for them. Not because the average student is deviously cackling in the corner about how they're going to pull one over on all their professors, but because they're cheating for the same reasons students have cheated for thousands of years. They're stressed, overwhelmed, afraid of their future, and desperate to gain the marker that says they did well enough so that they can have a job after graduation. Because everyone tells them, from their parents to their professors, that if they don't have as close to a perfect GPA as possible, no matter what it takes to get it, that they're doomed. Chat, we are not doomed. We are experiencing a time of crisis, but it is in times of crisis that we often witness the greatest innovation. And that innovation isn't always lauded with Nobel Prizes or given multi-million-dollar grants or on the covers of books or on the evening news or getting 5 million followers on TikTok. I don't know what that's like. I don't think I want to know what that's like. However, what I do know is that coming from a lineage of trans ancestors, coming from a lineage of disabled ancestors, of mad ancestors, of ancestors who died before their time, ancestors who were written off because of their race, coming to the work that I do now from a queer tradition, from a Jewish tradition, from an activist tradition. It is in times of crisis that people who are at the margins of the margins have always dreamed up tools, technologies to save us, to survive, and to lay the groundwork, to plant the seeds, for a better possible future. The image here is from a protest just in the last couple of years on climate crisis, race, and disability. Their banner says that the climate crisis is already here and that it's time for climate strike. This is a group of brown women organizing from outside of the borders of this country that we currently live in. That kind of organizing, it's not always in photographs and it's not always in the news, and yet it is that organizing that's happening in Vietnam among survivors of Agent Orange, that organizing happening in India among survivors of the Bhopal gas leak, that organizing that's happening in Tigray, that organizing that's happening in Palestine, that organizing that's happening in Chile. It's happening. The artwork here, which is over 10 years old, is from Michael Bazant. It says, disability justice means resisting together from solitary cells to open air prisons. It shows a black woman in a wheelchair wearing an orange jail uniform holding the hand of a Palestinian woman who is a double amputee across the lands where they live. To exist is to resist. We have always been fighting to live, to survive, and to be living in a future that is, in fact, worth fighting for, worth building, worth dreaming into existence. This is a picture of my friend, my colleague, Mimi Kook, a young-ish Southeast Asian woman. And the text here is where I want to pause for us, right? Because we can think about ableism as this big driving force behind eugenicist policy and practice, behind the gross disparity between what's happening at the highest levels of politics and money and power and what's happening in our lives, and right here to you all who are in this room or gathered from home. But ableism also lives deep within each of us. It's grown there. We've been taught to tend it for our entire lives. In 2019, Mimi uttered these words: we live and work in a machine that requires us to be well, that does not allow us to be unwell, that punishes us for being unwell, and that asks us to punish others for being unwell. We live in a time of crisis. Who among us is well? Some of us might have our good days. I do. I had a great day the other day. And we're all struggling to some degree or another. I don't know anybody who's not worried about the rising cost of gas because of an unprovoked war. I don't know anyone who's not worried about affording the food they put on the table. And I don't know anyone of the more than 80 students that I've had this semester who's not worried about what their future holds for them. I don't know anyone, not just here, but any of the places where I go or work, who feels amazing about what's happening to us right now and where we're headed in this moment. And yet, ableism teaches us we're supposed to somehow act like it's fine and like it's normal, that we are expected to fund and support funding to develop tech solely to build and reap bigger profits. The tech workers in Kenya and Venezuela being paid less than $2 a day to label data for ChatGPT and other generative AI companies are making a tiny fraction of the amount of pay for even one day of work by the average person living here employed by a tech company. And that person is making a fraction of the amount of money made in an hour by the richest men on this planet, who are tech billionaires. Something has to give. And we certainly shouldn't allow ourselves to continue to be deceived into accepting this myth that we have to be well through crisis. I understand eugenics and ableism as tied together. And our role as people concerned with our present and our future, is to resist that tide. This tapestry was created just a couple of years ago, 100 years after the international convening on eugenics. It was part of the anti-eugenics project, and in contrast to the image a couple of slides back, this tapestry is labeled the anti-eugenics tree. Naming and desiring and dreaming into the present, a society in which we might all flourish and receive care and justice, the very principles that are at the core of disability justice movement and disability justice struggle. I understand that all of the work happening now by policy advocates, by scholars, and student activists who have often been the vanguard of many high-profile activist campaigns, that when we're talking about the impact on justice and injustice of technology, we're not having that conversation in a vacuum. You want to talk about the rise of agentic AI, the increasing use of generative AI programs, or even debate over whether we should actually call such things AI. Leave that to the computer science theorists. These conversations cannot be divorced from an understanding of climate justice and labor justice and racial justice. Which communities have AI data centers built in them and which communities have successfully fought back? Well, Northern Virginia residents have fought back against construction of new AI data centers, and Northern Virginia happens to be among the wealthiest zip codes in the entire country. They have political power. Wealth in this country, because of the legacies of white supremacy, has often correlated closely with race. Class and race don't really operate entirely separately. Whose communities have water siphoned away from them to fuel the gross consumption of such resources to maintain AI data centers that are now being proposed in neighborhoods that are about 15 minutes away from my house. My county council has a session scheduled for 1 week from today. 1 week from today, about the question of construction for new AI data centers. And I'm sure for you all, you could tell me, I don't know, you can tell me where they are now and who's proposing to build the next ones in your neighborhoods. These are not questions divorced from other realities, other structural inequity, and the use of legal tools to make it possible. Who has the power to successfully sue for an injunction to stop a major tech company from building what it wants to build on land? Who has the power, economically or legally, to be able to mount a battle in court that could take years to resolve when you're still worried about your own groceries and gas bills? And who is able to meaningfully both opt out of using certain AI tools and also not be able to be left behind? You know, you talk to some disabled people and you'll hear a desire to build and put more AI technologies in our hands or on our roads because we want access and we don't trust other people to recognize our rights or follow the law or even care about us as human beings. I'm thinking, for example, about the many blind people who might be denied by 8 or 9 Ubers in a row because of their service dog, but really want to be able to have an autonomous vehicle where no driver is going to turn them away so that they can reliably, safely, and autonomously get where they want to go, pun intended. I'm also thinking about the many neurodivergent people, people with brain injuries, people with psych disabilities, people with developmental disabilities, who want to be able to rely upon a wider array of generative AI tools to be able to deal with the consequences of disorganized thinking and executive dysfunction. And then I think about who actually has the power. to choose who's building what technology and whose resources they're siphoning to do it. Facial recognition technology would be a great accessibility tool, but it's the cops and the mega corporations who are funding facial recognition technology software. It's ICE that's funding it. Speech and communication technologies, AI-driven or otherwise, could be a game changer for a lot of people with speech and communication disabilities. But who's actually benefiting? And who has the money and the time and the resources to actually test out those technologies or to be meaningfully and respectfully represented by them? Not most people who are multiply marginalized. More than 10 years ago, the late organizer and co-creator of disability justice movement, Patricia Byrne, said in an interview that while some disabled people, mainly wealthy, white privileged disabled people, are interested in funding engineering projects to design wheelchairs that can climb stairs, many disabled people of color wish that we would design power wheelchairs that wouldn't shut down and break when it rains. Who is actually going to benefit? The present and the future have always been closely interlinked, and we know that. Anyone who thinks about it for maybe more than 3 seconds knows that. But I think these conversations are not over. They're not concluded. They're not done with. We don't have to resign ourselves to the inevitability of a tech billionaire oligarch class. We don't have to resign ourselves to the inevitability of technology only existing to serve the most wealthy and powerful, or of technology only existing at the cost of gross labor injustice and climate catastrophe. I choose to believe in the brilliance of those who have been at the margins, engineering and dreaming. And that's what the other part of tonight's invitation is. Crip Feminist Technoscience sounds like a lot of vocabulary words strung together in a row. And I'm going to put it as simply as I can. Crip Feminist Technoscience offers us an invitation to think about who we assume creates knowledge, who knows things, who has wisdom, who designs things, who invents things, and who can we learn from and support in designing and building. Crip Feminist Technoscience then suggests that perhaps actually it is not just the non-disabled, cishet, white-moneyed men who are doing all of the inventing and the engineering and the building. It was disabled activists, Stacey Milburn Park, among many others, who co-founded the Disability Justice Culture Center in the Bay Area that distributed personal protective equipment and educated everyone in the area and beyond about how to survive in the increasingly violent and dangerous wildfires driven about by climate catastrophe. Those same activists organized to distribute and educate on personal protective equipment in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Why? Because disabled people already know what it means to be vulnerable, at risk, and the most likely to be left behind or abandoned, the most likely to die, the most likely to suffer in a disaster or a pandemic. We already know how to take care of each other if the government abandons us, if public health leaders don't listen to science, if the people who are controlling the purse strings choose not to release money and funding for necessary services and care, if our housing is at risk, if our food supply is at risk, if the attendant cancels, we already know what kinds of strategies exist to deal with that. We have always and already been inventors and engineers. That's what Crip Feminist Technoscience is about. I don't believe in a future where people with a lot of money and power are going to just get away with building whatever they want to just because they can, because we exist. And we're here, and you don't have to be a robotics engineer or a computer programmer or an architect or a construction worker to know how you can take care of people in your neighborhood, in your family, in your friendship circle, or to learn how. If you do have one of those skills, amazing. I'm very impressed by that. I took one programming class once and cried. And I would like to take a woodworking class, but I'm a little bit scared of saws. So if you have those skills, amazing. So I'm going to move past some of these quotes. I think they're really helpful. I think they're provocative. This is Arundhati Roy. And I want to move toward, in our concluding time tonight, what liberatory possibilities might exist built upon disability justice foundations. The law is itself not a tool of liberation. I want to be clear about that. Law in this country is built upon literally centuries of oppression, genocide, enslavement, holding up institutional racism, eugenics, you name it. Law is not going to get us free, and law is not going to save us. But if we ignore the technologies that law has to offer, we do so at our peril. We do so at our peril. Legal technologies can function at their best as tools for harm reduction, as tools of changing conditions to become more amenable or favorable to community care. Legal tools can also be means of slowing the gears of the machine, throwing a wrench in them. Just in the last week, I read an analysis of federal court decisions. I think it was published on the Marshall Project, which if you have not read, check out the Marshall Project, around writs of habeas corpus filed for people detained in immigration prisons. And this analysis found that in the vast majority of cases where an imprisoned immigrant was able to file a writ of habeas corpus, judges are, with a few exceptions, ordering that they be released from immigration prison. Now, does that change the fact that the federal government is currently arming and accelerating a very violent and racist policy of immigration enforcement? No. But if you ask those individual people and their families, did that matter to them? I think they would find it really insulting and offensive if any of us, especially those of us that hold a stable status, were to say that doesn't matter because the law can't free us. The law as a technology is a vitally important one, and it will not free us. Our legislative and regulatory tools will bring us things like OSHA standards that, prevent workers from being maimed and killed on the job. Standards that were earned through labor activists fighting and sometimes dying. Laws against child labor, or working 90-hour work weeks in a factory where you're breathing in toxic chemicals. Does that still happen? Yes. Will something bad happen to the company if they're caught? Depends. It might. But 100 years ago, it wouldn't have. There would be no question about it. The law as a tool can get people money. Will that solve the issue of trauma or horrific violence done? No. But we all know what it's like to struggle and worry about paying bills. Money matters. If law is going to get you money, let it get you money. Law as a technology can help us curb some of the worst abuses that tech corporations and others might wish to enact. And we can get creative with law. I just gave this advice to a friend of mine who is also a relatively new lawyer the other day. And that advice is, if you didn't know this, if you are ever involved in a court case, sorry if you are, that you can technically ask a court to do pretty much anything. You just file a motion. There doesn't have to be an existing template for it or an established precedent. You might not win, but you can try. And lawyers have been doing that, especially lawyers working in concert with social movement, for a very long time. We can get creative. We can restructure and reimagine what a legal concept might mean so that we can better fight to protect our communities, so that we can better fight for just conditions of labor or of housing or healthcare or any other area where human lives, well-being, and freedom are at stake. This is artwork that says, never mistake law for justice. Justice is an ideal and law is a tool. It is a tool. It's a powerful one. And we can use that tool in service of and in alignment with the ideals of justice. I think that is necessary work. It's not work that we all will do. It's not work that will animate every possible strategy or campaign. But it's work that we have to nurture and make space for if we're going to survive the present moment of crisis. We need to leverage all the tools we've got. We need to fight with everything in our toolbox, and we need to support one another in that struggle. Last things that I will leave us with, some thoughts on disability justice. This framework is a distinct movement created about 20 years ago that's intersectional by design, led by Black, brown, queer, and trans disabled people, and seeks to radically transform society and culture outside of law and policy. Disability justice is, in other words, an invitation to dream. That is the title of a fantastic collection of writing by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinghe, who lived and organized for a long time here in Seattle. And the title of that collection is Dreaming Disability Justice. Disability justice is an invitation to dream. I think it is also an invitation to build. At some point, our dreams have to turn into action. At some point, our dreams have to translate into the actual tools and practices that we can engage in to support one another, to make tools and share tools and teach each other how we can survive, how we can still steal moments of joy and rest, how we can make glimpses of the future, glimpses of a better world, the blueprint for building that better world. I believe in a future where technology is about respecting human dignity, and technologies that we build respect and sustainably exist with the resources that we have on this planet we live on. I believe in a future where we build technologies not to harm people, not to reinforce systems of oppression, but to care for people. I believe in a future where we're not debating the merits of generative AI, but where we take care of each other. I believe in a future where we're not pitting the needs of the present against sustainability in the long haul. I believe in a future where we embrace disability as a natural part of human existence and experience, and where we've eliminated the kinds of harm that create disability born of trauma and violence, because I believe in a future where we don't have to be afraid of being murdered or killed or discriminated against or homeless if we can't work, because I believe in a future where we all receive care no matter what. We all receive care no matter what. I believe in a future where we are all held with care, we are all honored, where we are all able to live and to be. I believe in that future, and I'm working to build it. I hope that you will join me in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions from the audience now. Would anyone like to come up and ask a question? I can also start with what I have in my hand. Starting from the top, how can technologists create collective power for positive change from within, given the power shift away from unions? And technologists is defined broadly here, including engineers, designers, researchers.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say to that question is unionize. You gotta talk union. If you don't do it, who else is going to? You know, it might seem impossible to try to unionize against the biggest and most powerful corporations, but Amazon workers have been organizing. Starbucks workers have been organizing. If you are working in tech, someone you love is working in tech, and they're thinking, I don't think we have that power. Well, that's exactly what they want you to think. And that's exactly the same myth that union-busting corporate stools have been peddling for more than a century. Unionize. The second thing that I'll say to that, other than saying that you should unionize, is redirect power. Be the cog in the machine. You can strike. You can sabotage for legal reasons. I do not mean to do anything illegal. I mean, you can take resources and use them to pay people from marginalized communities. If you were supposed to pay user testers, who are you paying to do that? I mean, you can actively recruit people for your paid internships at this big company who don't just come from the top-ranked schools and their programs, and people who perhaps have an unconventional background or educational background. You can focus on and advocate for safety controls about the tools that you are building and developing. We can actually do a lot more than perhaps we give ourselves credit for. We just have to get creative.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm curious to understand how you approach conveying this message in environments that may have like the more established ableist framework, where it might not, we're in an academic and you know everyone here has chosen to be here. Like, how do you approach communicating this message in different environments?
So that is a great question, and I would say, one, there isn't really an environment where there's no ableism. Even those of us who are disabled and deeply embedded in disability activism, we're also indoctrinated into ableism. We can replicate ableist ideas and practices, and so can our organizations and groups. So I don't think there really is a space where folks are not ableist, but there are a lot of spaces where maybe some people care more about ableism and other spaces where they don't give a shit. And if we're in the kind of space where people aren't already thinking about disability and ableism, I find that all the same tools of rhetoric and persuasion and advocacy that work in any other context are also effective. Be relatable. Make sure people understand why they should be personally invested. Maybe you need to tell a story that horrifies people so they're like, wait, what's happening? Like, for example, did you know that in the United States, it is still 100% legal to pay disabled people cents per hour? It's called Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, ironically named. Or that in the United States, there is an institution where disabled people are subjected to painful electric shock as punishment, and it's legal. You know, sometimes people react to that because they're like, I'm sorry, I thought you were just worried about someone saying an offensive word. What's happening? And then people might be a little more invested. But I also find that it's very effective for us in any context to really dig deep into solidarity. Anytime we talk about disability, we are talking about an experience and a form of oppression that most affects people who are already marginalized. Every marginalized group has a higher rate of disability than every analogously privileged one because of the consequences of poverty, racism, misogyny, etc. For instance, the number one leading cause of concussions, which can cause a long-term traumatic brain injury, not athletic injury, domestic violence, right? So when people understand that our struggles are deeply tied together and deeply interconnected, and therefore our advancement, our freedom is also deeply tied together, they tend to be invested.
Hi, my name is Jay. I'm actually a part of Seattle Revolutionary Socialists, which is like an awesome organization. Actually, the previous question asked a lot of questions I had, which was like, especially in like intellectual spaces, it feels like sometimes there's like this like moralizing or kind of like a hierarchy of like what's considered a good strategy. And I've just like personally been encountering that a lot, especially because like, I guess like I like put myself down by saying like I'm dumb, but it's just that I'm not like studied in like certain areas that are like valued in politics, like more psychologically rather than like historically. And so I guess my question is like, well, number one, it's like, how do we start creating the basis of like raising the working class consciousness to be more like, to make these teachings more accessible, like rights of workers more accessible to like the workers, and also like, how do you like stay strong in the face of like being a minority voice when like a lot of the strategies I'm proposing would be effective strategies for someone like me who isn't the target demographic of someone getting into politics, who isn't really strong in history, who, you know, I guess like doesn't believe in violence. Yeah, so those are my questions. Thank you.
Great set of questions. First thing I want to say, aside from you and I, how many people in this room identify as socialists by a show of hands, or something associated with socialism? Okay, now keep your hand up if you identify as a socialist and you've ever read Karl Marx. A few of you have actually read Karl Marx. I have read pieces of Karl Marx, so I can only sort of raise my hand. How many of you who raise your hand and identify as socialists feel like you've been very educated on all of the intellectual canonical writing of socialist thinkers of the last century by a show of hands? I'm seeing one maybe hand. Okay, so please feel better about yourself immediately that many of us are socialists and are not reading every allegedly canonical socialist writer. The second thing I want to say is I'm going to start with your second part of your question, raising working class consciousness. I think in some ways, it's a conceited question, and I don't mean that as an insult, okay? So I want to be really clear. I'm using this word conceited, and it's not about you. I think the question is conceited because it implies that working class folks who might not be in an institution of higher education aren't conscious, can't be conscious, aren't theorizing, or aren't teaching, right? And it's a very analogous phenomenon to what happens to a lot of disabled people. You'll get a lot of disabled people who, like me, have a college degree and might talk with big sounding words. And there's people like me who fit that profile who say we need to teach people with disabilities who are outside colleges, the ones in psych hospitals or in the long-term group homes, about disability activism. I'm like, you know, those people actually led the way in disability activism. Do you know about Willowbrook residents organizing against the abuses and violence happening there? In Germany, there's an entire archive of writings and zines and political education materials made by psych patients. Here in the United States, the whole foundations of the neurodiversity movement were led by people who were deemed the R word. People like Mel Baggs. And similarly, in socialist circles that are dominated by people who might have a college degree or some other form of formal education and who do not come from a working class background already, there is often this conceit that, well, because we're using certain theoretical language and frameworks, working class people, whether immigrants who are working class or working class people who have been here forever, regardless of whether they're people of color or white, don't have that language and need to be educated. And I'm like, who do you think's been unionizing for the last 150 years? Who do you think has actually been organizing the committees to make sure that there are strike funds to take care of people not being paid during a strike, right? Like, not the people with the college degrees, actually, not the people who have been working in a professional class job and don't come from a working class family. Some people who come from a working class community manage to get the degree, but that is also still a different position than folks who have been generationally working class. And it is not the people who have the most privilege who have been doing that on the ground work. So I think to flip the question around, it's how do we build bridges between socialist organizers who might be coming from a place of more class privilege and who might not be from the working class, with working class folks, whether or not they're using the word socialist, some of whom certainly are, some of whom might not be, but who are already doing that work in alignment with socialism. And I think that's the better question to be asking. And as to the first part of the question that you asked, how do we stay in the struggle, not get demoralized, and consider that some people might try to make a hierarchy of tactics? I personally choose to opt out of trying to make a hierarchy. I don't think that engaging in legal advocacy strategically is either more important or less valuable than people who are organizing a demonstration. Because you could argue, well, legal advocacy only benefits the most privileged. That is sometimes true. It's not always true. All those people just released from immigration prison because of lawyers, I don't think would agree with that. But you could also argue, well, what is a protest doing? Is it just performative? Maybe for some people, but also it sends a very public signal about what will and will not be accepted. Hungary just ousted Viktor Orban because of mass protest and direct action. I don't think that was performative, right? So I don't think that it's useful or productive to invest in conversations trying to say that some tactics, some tools, some technologies are more needed in movement than others. The only scenario where I'm going to say that there is something that perhaps is more needed is people need to make the food and clean the kitchen and wash the dishes. Someone has to do that. Because if you don't do that, we don't have food for the people protesting or going to court. And that is work that has often been highly feminized and therefore degraded and devalued. Also often racialized. So that's the closest that you'll ever hear me coming to say there's some work that needs to be done that really is super extra necessary. But we're not all able to do everything. Being disabled has taught me that. We cannot all do everything, and we cannot do it all at all times. That is why we need a multiplicity of tactics, a multiplicity of types of organizations in the ecosystem of groups that are struggling for justice and freedom. When I say organizations, I don't just mean 501c3s and C4s. I mean any kind of group or autonomous collective, or sometimes the 501c3s.
Hello, friend. This is Inquita. I guess my question is to this audience. As a person with, well, I'll back it up. It seemed like your lecture today or your talk today was like the impact of outer culture on us as individuals with disabilities. But I hardly ever, and I speak of it, I hardly ever hear about the impact of the inner culture that is very toxic, that literally creates a space for those of us who may not have alphabets behind our names, but we're very, very affluent within connecting with how to navigate the disabilities world. Not only that, but, and I choose not to, and that's the thing, being able to create a space where all abilities and thoughts are at the table, and that there's no I'm trying to think of a word. There's no gatekeeping, or how would you actually connect that to this space?
Yeah, so I think the question you're asking about is toxic insular community dynamics.
Yes.
Right? Where maybe there's a cool kids table.
Yes.
And then the people that are not at the cool kids table.
Yes.
And also, many of us will often feel like, and I've been there a lot, we're not at the cool kids table. Sometimes I think other people will perceive us as being at the cool kids table, even if we feel like we're not. That's also a common dynamic, but that's a side note.
Best thing, I don't want to be at the cool table.
But here's what I'm gonna say about that. There is no one disability community, and there never has been.
Yes.
There never has been. And that's also true if you delete the word disability and replace it with any other identifier or group. There's not just one queer community, thank God.
Yes.
There's not just one socialist community, also thank God. And personally, as a human being,
Yes.
and I'm committed to being in this work for the long haul, I make community where I am welcomed.
Yes.
If there's a group or a space, formal or informal, where I am being treated badly, and now there's a difference between some people don't get along with me and being treated badly. That's not the same.
Yes.
There's also a difference between some people don't agree with me and
Yes.
being treated badly. That's also not the same. If I'm being treated badly, I don't need to be there. And that's not because, to the question that was asked earlier, I think that that space shouldn't exist. Perhaps there are other people that are treated very well there, and I want the work to happen, even if the people doing it are people who I wouldn't like or want to be in a relationship with of some kind.
Yes.
But I don't have to be part of that.
Yes.
I'm going to choose to invest my time, my energy, my spoons in spaces that value me, that value what I'm doing, and that care about me as a human being. And if there are spaces, disability community or otherwise, that don't do that, I'm going to choose to not be there, because it's not going to happen that there's going to be some magical world in which there's a space where zero gatekeeping has ever happened, where there's no concept of someone being charismatic or having a cult of personality or creating a cool kids table. Like, you're never going to find a space where this has literally never happened. But what you can find are spaces that are trying to resist those dynamics, as well as spaces where even if they've had those dynamics, at least no one's acting toxically because of it. And that's what I try to do, is seek out, nurture, and invest in those spaces.
Yeah, I just wanted that to resonate in the room, because most people, yeah, thank you.
Hello. First, I'm so glad that you're here. You're literally one of my favorite autistic advocates, and I'm just so happy that I've got to see you speak. I'm a graduate student at UW Bothell, studying community health and social justice. It's one of a unique program, only 2 exist in the country for that. And I'm an autistic mom to a non-speaking autistic 7-year-old. And I like to look at things. I really appreciate your tools to liberation. I feel like that was as far as using law in ways to change systems, and that's something that I truly believe in, what I'm striving to do and want to do, is I started my graduate studies program, and why I'm doing what I'm doing, not for any career reasons, just other than to change systems. And so I think one of the big things for me is looking at ABA therapy, right? And how ever since Medicaid approved that as a funded go-to therapy for autistic kids. It's as soon as you get an autism diagnosis, that's what is recommended to every parent. And I'm fully aware, of all the harms that ABA has created historically for autistic people. And so I guess my question is so more and more ABA clinics open, and they prey off of the ableist fears of mostly unknowing parents, and while expending tons of Medicaid funding that could be used to actually support autistic people in other ways. And because as recent news stories, even from Wall Street Journal, put out a story about that, about how much Medicaid is just being spent and frauds being claimed through ABA clinics. And so with something that's that huge of a medical complex, I'm wondering if you have any way to advise me on how to tackle that, because that is something I'm really passionate about doing.
So just to clarify, are you looking for ideas about fighting against ABA?
Changing Medicaid funding, probably, I think, because I think that's the source of where all of this capitalistic drive came behind it, right? And now it's just that's just
Autism Speaks lobbying dollars.
Yeah, that drove that change in the Medicaid policy there. Okay, so then, yeah, how do we then change that, and get rid of that? And that's a huge question, I understand, but I just don't even know how to tackle that at all.
So there's a few ways to think about it, and one strategy that some autistic and allied advocates have used for the last couple of years is trying to incorporate a ban on essentially conversion therapy for disability into bills to ban conversion therapy for queer and trans youth. That is one method. The difficulty is that if you ask a lot of folks, which I'm sure you have and had those conversations, what is ABA, that there are many providers who will say, oh, I know how abusive and bad the history is, but that's not what I'm doing.
It's different
And
now.
some of them are deceiving themselves, and some of them, I would argue, are actually telling the truth, but they're billing what they're saying is ABA because that's what will get them reimbursed. They might not actually be doing any kind of recognizable ABA as trying to just behavior modify and force compliance training on autistic and other disabled children, but they have to say it's ABA to the public and to CMS in order to get paid. And that's what can make it really tricky to say, what are we banning? But that being said, I think it's very promising to try to tie bans of conversion therapy for disability, which is where ABA comes from, into bans on conversion therapy for queer and trans people. I also think that, realistically speaking, the current administration that runs CMS will not care about things that our community says. So that means that a lot of the work has to be grassroots education, because a lot of the families that enroll their kids in ABA, I would venture to say that the vast majority of them aren't doing so because they hate their kid, or they think autism is evil, or they think that it will magically cure their kid either. They're doing it because they do have ableist ideas, because that's how we're all raised, and that's what the professionals are telling them, is in order to help your child, if you love your child, you will enroll them in this therapy. And for those who don't know what that is, ABA is applied behavior analysis. And it was originated in a series of experiments funded in the 1960s by the National Institutes for Mental Health, funding Ole, O-L-E, Ivar, I-V-A-R, Lovas, L-O-V-A-A-S, that's his name, to experiment on using reward and punishment to prevent homosexuality and to treat autism in a set of experiments done in the same decade. And so modern ABA comes out of that. That is what is being discussed. It is today touted by most people who are not autistic activists as the best evidence-based treatment for autism, with most pediatricians recommending that children diagnosed as young as 3 years old as autistic should be put into 40 hours a week of ABA. Think about that, 40 hours a week for a toddler. I'm an adult, and 40 hours a week makes me cry. Of like being employed. I mean, who else has felt that as employed? 40 hours a week makes us cry. It's a lot of folks, right? So that's the recommendation. And applied behavior analysis often functions to suppress, to forcibly suppress or eliminate characteristics associated with or perceived as signs that the person is autistic. So that's the discussion that's happening for those who don't know.
Well, with 504, recently being 504 plans, and just 504 disability rights being contested by 8 states, I believe now. Most states have dropped out of that, but there's 8 states that are still trying to change those disability rights, and they're doing it because of transgendered, gender affirming care, and that they're trying to ban. That's basically they're not even considering the fact that it's affecting thousands and thousands of disabled people, but is that kind of a dangerous route to go? I feel like if we're gonna just say that it's also has to do with
So
conversion
these
therapy. Yeah.
efforts are happening at state level, not federal.
Okay.
And you should follow up with me later if you want to continue this conversation.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Because I actually don't know off the top of my head what those states are, but I can find out and get back to you.
Oh, okay, yeah, thank you.
I'm so sorry to interrupt an amazing conversation, but we are 10 minutes over the end of our time, so I have to be the bad person here and close out the conversation. And I will just say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful time together.
Thank you.